I told you the non-financial companies should stay out of the Forex markets. Another Japanese company has been pounded in the forward market. Kashima Oil has just announced a loss of 61.9 billion yen. At least it is only half the loss that other Japanese oil refinery, Showa Shell, had to swallow last year. I wonder what the stock market will think of this baby. Showa's equity value dropped in half when the news of their foreign exchange loss broke.
Come off it. Kashima is an oil refinery. They were just trying to hedge their currency risk. Oil is priced in dollars, and they were buying dollars in the forward market, and the exchange rate moved against them. It's just bad luck. It could have gone the other way.
This is not so simple. Should an oil company be hedging in the foreign exchange market? What really happened? Did they simply get a bad shock? Subtle quickly learned that the Japanese oil refineries, Showa Shell and Kashima, are exposed to foreign exchange risk. All contracts in the oil business are settled in dollars, implying that these companies have dollar costs because they import crude oil, and they have yen revenues because they sell their refined oil in Japan. Showa Shell and Kashima face the risk that their yen costs will escalate if the dollar appreciates unexpectedly. To hedge that risk, both companies routinely buy dollars in the forward market for several months and sometimes years ahead. It happens to be the case that the forward yen price of the dollar was usually lower than the prevailing spot rate when most of these contracts were struck. So the forward contracts reduced the cost of the dollars relative to the prevailing spot rate and protected the companies against the risk of a dollar appreciation. However, the relevant comparison rate to judge the ex-post benefit of the hedge is the future exchange rate at which crude oil would have been bought had the oil refineries not hedged. There were quite a few instances where the dollar did not appreciate relative to the yen, and in fact, the actual yen price of the dollar in the future turned out to be lower than the forward rate the companies had agreed to. In such cases, the companies would have been better off ex post not to hedge. They would have had lower yen costs by buying the dollars they needed in the spot market with the stronger yen. Unfortunately, as Subtle read on, he learned that these companies did not just hedge. People in the company's finance departments who were authorized to make forward contracts expected the dollar to appreciate. They thought they could profit from this outlook, and they agreed to forward contracts for much more than the actual currency exposure the companies had from their underlying oil businesses. In other words, people at both companies were speculating in an effort to make a profit. When the yen continued to appreciate and the speculators' losses mounted, they did not disclose these losses to their superiors. They instead hid the losses from their company's accounting statements and simply entered into additional forward contracts with their banks, hoping that the yen would eventually fall in value. Showa's total losses finally mounted to 125 billion yen, and Kashima's to 152.5 billion yen. Hedging versus speculating. Subtle Truth decided to analyze this case step by step. Pure speculation in the currency markets does not seem to be a great idea for any corporate finance department. In addition, not disclosing mounting losses to your shareholders is illegal in most countries. So on that part, Auntie is right. Kashima should not have dabbled in foreign exchange markets the way it did. Not surprisingly, Japan's regulatory authorities cracked down on the practice of non-disclosure, and new disclosure rules regarding unrealized losses or profits from forward contracts in the forward exchange markets were instituted in the wake of the oil companies' debacles. Why was Freedy so convinced that this was absolutely a normal thing to do? Certainly, if Kashima has a number of contracts to buy oil in the future with dollars, and we view this as a source of transaction exposure, it makes sense to hedge, right? After all, Kashima has a dollar liability, and by buying dollars forward, it obtains a dollar asset in exchange for a yen liability. This allows it to lock in the future transaction price in yen, getting rid of the effect of uncertain future exchange rates. Of course, ex post, there may be a cost to hedging because the yen may keep appreciating. But at least they did not lose sleep over exchange rate movements, and they can better budget future operations. But Subtle had a nagging feeling this might not be the full story. You see, Kashima and Showa Shell's whole businesses are structured around buying oil with dollars, refining the oil, and selling it for yen in the local Japanese market. Not only do they do this now, but they plan to be doing the same thing for the conceivable future. In other words, their exchange rate exposures do not just arise from a single transaction. Exchange rate movements can really affect the bottom line of companies. Consequently, if they hedge, they should at least have a long-term hedging plan in place. Also, it may be that forward contracts are not the right hedging vehicles. Suttle had heard that these contracts are only liquid when the maturity is shorter than 1 year, and that the transaction costs for longer-term contracts are higher. In lieu of forward contracts, are there other contracts out there for longer-term hedging? If the companies think long-term, don't they also need to worry about inflation and oil price movements? Maybe an increase in oil price or an increase in the yen-dollar rates is not so bad for the oil refining companies if the general price level in Japan goes up too, and they can pass the increase in their costs through to their customers in the form of higher yen prices for the refined oil they sell. Suttle started to have some doubts about the benefits of hedging, even for firms such as Kashima and Showa Shell. He concluded that he better keep reading the international financial management text he had just picked up from his bookshelf.